back to the series of videos in which we show you different aspects of the CLI-MIC pedagogical plan. In this video, we're going to talk about communication and discourse for the classroom. Let's get started. First, comics are a form of communication that combines visual and verbal elements within a certain structure. They are essentially made up of a series of panels, available in different formats. Nowadays, the most common ones are paper and screen. Their decoding requires the development of certain skills that can be included in what is generally referred to as visual literacy, although they should be understood as a specific form of it. The integration of comics in an educational setting also depends on the discursive dynamics of the classroom. This CLI-MIC pedagogical plan is a starting point, and it's up to the teachers to adapt the content to the specific pedagogical needs of a given teaching context. In other videos, we had a look at scenarios, form, and perspective in comics. This time, however, we want to talk about how comics are intertwined with other discourses or forms of communication that are of paramount importance for environmental awareness and responsibility. This pedagogical project proposes a kind of paradigm shift in the didactics of visual literacy. The hypothesis is that understanding the forms of communication of comics will increase awareness of how content is shaped and how attitudes are expressed in the discourse. The aim is to show forms of communication that are unique to comics and how they contribute to generating environmental awareness. Since comics can show different areas, they can present different ways of looking at the very complex phenomenon of climate change. They can show different social practices, negotiations, economic aspects, or the participation in a wider discussion. When comics are used in the classroom, instructors and students are entering into a discussion that precedes and goes beyond this form of communication. Everything that comics can show us, they do so through their particular way of encoding information and generating communication, and through their way of entering into and engaging with other discourses. So it is not just illustrating something that is already known in another way. In educational contexts, comics function as a tool for communication. Specific terms are necessary to describe, analyze, or discuss comics, and to then use this tool as efficiently as possible. We have discussed numerous terms like panels, balloons, captions, etc. in the prior 4 videos. Teachers should also acquire knowledge about certain historical aspects of the development of comics. With basic knowledge and the right skills, comics will function as another tool to communicate and to develop discourses that meet the desired goals. The definition of these goals begins before and goes beyond the concrete use of comics. For example, integrating them in the development of skills within a thematic area or producing comics as an expressive tool. Climate change presents a major challenge for teachers and learners because of the enormous amount of resources required to understand certain phenomena. The comic can combine discourses in different perspectives. Its ability to visually simplify information makes it adaptable for communication in various STEAM subjects. That is, science, technology, engineering, arts, and maths. By using comics in a certain context, we are participating in discourses that precede and go beyond this particular form of verbal-visual communication. When using comics to learn about climate change and environmental responsibility, it is not just a question of which methodology to use in the classroom, but also of the type of goals to set for the use of comics. For instance, you can analyze a comic strip to understand a natural phenomenon such as glaciation, global warming, or extensive littering and its consequences. Or talk about a particular experience to illustrate the consequences of climate change for certain people. For example, how a particular character experiences the droughts caused by global warming. Some school subjects will include more objective elements about the evolution of Earth and nature, presenting factual and general information. Others will present more experiential aspects, subject to other types of discourse that belong to everyday life and have more individual characteristics. Or one could even produce a comic strip with the goal of developing the aesthetic expression of a particular message. For example, presenting contrasting perspectives in a visual verbal discourse through the development of a script and a drawing. In any case, visual and verbal aspects that are particular to communicating through comics are embedded in and interwoven with scientific, cultural, or social discourses and social conducts. When we define goals for working with comics, these goals are always linked to the structure of comics, as was shown in the previous videos. The visual and verbal structure of a comic must be analyzed and adapted for classroom use. What needs to be considered is the content, so the what is being told or explained, and the how, so the way in which the what is represented. We need to analyze, select, describe, and adapt the comics to a real-world classroom context. One of the key points we need to consider is how the comic enables cohesion and coherence in the comic narrative. Cohesion refers to the internal organization of the elements of the narrative. For example, if the visual and verbal aspects of a panel make it possible to create a logical meaning of the elements shown, cohesion was achieved. This needs to be considered internally and also at the level of several panels. Coherence, on the other hand, concerns the logical meaning and organization of all the elements of the narrative as a whole. This can be in a series of panels that are linked to other more complex sequences, such as different timelines that have their own internal logic. For example, a memory of a character can be presented as content of another sequence. We can then read the two sequences as one coherent story of a character at two different times and perhaps in two different places. Comics need and use a big amount of implicit and explicit knowledge, like the use and recognition of forms and symbols in a particular culture. That means when we are seeing a schematic drawing, we are able to perceive it as information about something or as a story connected to someone. This visual reduction is always present in the drawings. They can range from detail to significant schematization. We can recognize the character as a person or as something who speaks, thinks, and feels. Basic socio-cultural practices can determine the expectations and possible inferences regarding a certain narrative. That is, specific behaviors or distinctive ways of understanding the anchoring of a narrative in the world. A visual metaphor is an image used to represent or symbolize something else. They are another form used in comics to encode information. This also includes conventions in the use of tables, graphs, statistics, etc. A story world is the narrative universe created in a story with characters in a specific space and time. The experiential content of story worlds can delimit emotional states that offer possibilities of identification with characters, both at the level of the story and the different implicit and explicit discourses and perspectives. This also makes it possible to introduce experiences of realities that may be unfamiliar to students. Teachers must therefore decide which elements are likely to be most beneficial for the goals they set, and predict with which characters students may emphasize, or in relation to which a form of estrangement will be beneficial for classroom discussions. Comics represent language in action through a system that depicts oral speech, which allows access to specific vocabulary in different registers and accents. Comics also show language used in the real world and in different textual genres, as well as with particular language registers. This variety makes the comic especially suitable for the classroom, for example in language classes, allowing more abstract explanations to be integrated into concrete experiential content in different discursive levels and within a variety of language uses. The omission of information, which is a common feature of comics, allows the recipients to make inferences about the sequences. We read the visual and verbal material in the form of a plot, a storyline, a description, or a verbal paraphrase, which is then subject to positioning and discussion in relation to a depicted situation. With a reduced visual and verbal input, a greater amount of discursive production of task-based work can be achieved. We already know that establishing goals makes it necessary to contextualize and adapt the comic according to the goals set in a particular learning environment. Finding the right examples for the classroom requires a broad knowledge of published comics and authors, and perhaps also a historical overview of comics dealing with issues related to climate change and environmental responsibility. Examples can be chosen from a wide range of comics suitable for the classroom, for example from the field of science communication, as they show a close relationship to contrasting scientific discourses such as the work of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Current comic stories that relate phenomena resulting from climate change and that have a serious impact on the lives of groups or individuals open up a different range of educational opportunities. They make it possible to approach particular experiences, details of lives that may be closer or further away from certain contexts, but that have an experiential and emotional touch that scientific dissemination does not convey. The diversity of narratives about science and technology, as well as the consequences, fears, and utopian or dystopian projections associated with these topics, are part of a consistent element of science fiction. They project a current state from the moment of production into the future, or retrospectively into the past. This way of looking at reality is very useful, because it allows us to distance ourselves, to relativize our own perspective, and to recenter ourselves through an awareness gained through the angle from which we observe the diversity of ways of living in the world and of representing human activity and its consequences. Much of the use of comics in the classroom focuses on receptive skills. However, producing comics to organize discourse or information is a creative use of comics. The ability to communicate a message effectively using images and words, and an awareness of the use of the form and the functions of the components of the comic allow us to present information in a visual narrative. It is not a matter of drawing correctly, but of organizing information in a coherent and cohesive way. To make planning easier, the coherent use of image and word in panels can be facilitated at the production level by ready-made structures, such as templates of regular and irregular panels of different lengths. The regular use of popular panel structures promotes a certain type of narrative. Their manipulation, such as changing the frame of the panel or combining several panels to form a single splash panel, both horizontally and vertically, offers different communicative possibilities regardless of the subject matter. To explain experiences or describe state of affairs, human beings constantly resort to narratives. A narration by means of visual and verbal signs needs to coordinate both modes of expression. Narrating and enabling participation in discourse through comics requires a particular set of skills that both teachers and learners must develop through training and which are not inherently available to them. The narrative in comics represents action, that is, what happens to someone at a given time and place. It consists generally of the development of an action, however brief it may be, in which we see a change from one situation to another, so something that happens to one or more characters. Understanding the plot allows us, if attention is paid to the discrete elements, to focus on the mechanisms that are used to generate changes, to highlight perspectives, and to determine the implicit values that casually determine the action or the explanation of an action. With this video, we end the series of videos created to approach the CLI-MIC pedagogical plan. We hope you enjoyed watching the videos and that they will help you to start your own journeys into the world of comics, and, in particular, to work with comics that are about climate change and environmental responsibility. See you soon!